Listen up. Walk with me into the shop and smell the oil and polymer. That's where the real talk starts. Ruger teamed with Magpul to drop a pistol that's quietly shaking up familiar ground. The Ruger RXM. On the surface, it looks like a half-breed of what we've used for years, but the way it's built flips the script on what a frame means. This isn't a simple parts swap. Ruger handled the upper engineering. Magpul stamped out the lower world. But here's the trick. The serialized guts, the part that legally counts, are not the molded frame. The serialized component is a removable fire control insert. Think of it as the small island of consequence floating inside a sea of custom frames. When you pull that insert out, the rest is just grip and cosmetic choices. The insert is the firearm. The polymer is the dress. Why does that matter to you? Because every owner, tinkerer, and gunsmith starts to see possibilities. Aftermarket frames, aluminum, aggressive texture, custom panels suddenly accept the same heart. Sharps Brothers makes an aluminum chassis with changeable 1911 style grip panels, and Icarus fields a no-nonsense aggressive frame that wears the insert like it was made for it. Magpul makes its own polymer replacements too. The point is this: modularization opens up personalization without touching the serialized bit. Now, don't let that modular talk make you think this is some weird proprietary oddity. Slide rails, guide rod, barrel, safety plunger, striker, slide cover, plate, most of the upper is essentially Glock Gen 3 geometry. When you look inside that insert, you'll see familiar parts. A trigger bar that behaves like a Glock trigger bar, an ejector that nods to Glock design, and a striker system that runs like a Glock 19. The trigger housing is different, the shape, the capture points, but the mechanical dance inside, very recognizable. Out of the box, the trigger feels honest. Measured against my deadweight gauge, you're in the ballpark of 4 to 4.5 pounds on a good day. That's a serviceable, shootable pull for a battle pistol straight from the crate. The safe action concept lives here too, a passive safety architecture in the shoe of the trigger that makes it predictable under stress. Disassembly, familiar but with new choreography. Lock the slide, walk the slide assembly off the frame, and you're staring at the serialized FCI on the side, the part you register, the heart of the gun. 3 main capture points hold it into the lower. 1 larger capture pin, 1 smaller pin, and the slide lock itself. Remove those, and the insert will come free. But don't be cavalier. Springs hide, and a leaf spring for the slide lock will try to escape if you're not paying attention. I like using a stout punch for the big pin and a smaller drift for the skinny pin. The large pin has cutouts that sneak into a frame spring. Twist it as you back it out, and the pressure lets go. The skinny pin takes a firmer hand, and the slide lock rides on a leaf spring depressible like a Glock Gen 3 part. When you coax everything out and ease the FCI from its notch, you realize how modern production has blurred the line between serialized mechanism and cosmetic lower. And here's where the tension sharpens. You can buy an aggressive aluminum frame, drop the FCI in, and suddenly you're carrying a custom-feeling pistol that runs Glock parts. But that interchangeability brings one danger: assembly that isn't respected equals parts walking. There's a spring that gives that big pin purpose. If you don't transplant it into aftermarket frames, that pin will work itself loose under recoil and time. Little details, huge consequences. We've taken it apart and seen what's under the skin. Next, I'll put this FCI into an aftermarket chassis and show you the pitfalls, the tricks, and why a tiny leaf spring can be the difference between a reliable fight gun and a trip back to the bench. All right, you've got the FCI in hand, and now comes the surgery. Slide that serialized insert toward the hook in the rear of the chassis until you feel it seat. Don't muscle it, ease it. The back ledge will catch first, and then the front will want to sit down into the well. If you rush, you'll fight the geometry and flirt with lost springs. Here's the mechanics reality. Aftermarket aluminum or aggressive polymer. Lowers rarely include every tiny captive spring or locator that Magpul engineered into its factory frames. That small leaf spring that holds the slide lock in place, not always present in aftermarket offerings. That 12 or 14 millimeter thing your brain ignores under a quick glance is what keeps a capture pin from walking loose after 1,000 rounds. So, before you button the gun up, verify the spring transfer. If the chassis didn't include it, transplant the original Magpul spring and seat it into the 2 little capture holes. That little transplant is the difference between a reliable carry pistol and parts rediscovering gravity at 3 a.m. in the middle of a course of fire. Next up, aligning the big pin. Start the big pin from the side, with the smaller head first, so you can rotate the larger head into final position. You'll need to compress the chassis slightly to get that mating hole to line up. Use a nylon-tipped hammer and feather it in until the head clears and the cutouts index into the spring. If you feel heavy resistance, stop, something's misaligned. The shotgun approach of pounding until it fits invites bent pins and ruined frames. Slide lock installation is a dance, not a shove. Depress that leaf spring with a small punch, feed the slide lock in at an angle, and confirm the spring captures it without popping out. After that, drift in the skinny pin from the opposite side. A proper install will have the slide operate smoothly with no wiggle in the FCI. If the slide rakes crooked or the takedown lever binds, strip it down and hunt the misalignment. It's never worth field modifying a hole to compensate for sloppy assembly. Magazine compatibility. This is where the RXM earns brownie points. The lower accepts Glock Gen 3 magazines out of the gate. That means your existing Glock magazine inventory slides right in and drops cleanly. But note, one aftermarket smart move. Icarus added a Gen 4 style magazine button on its chassis, giving you ambidextrous control without fumbling. If you install a Gen 3 button into an aluminum chassis that's engineered for Gen 4 geometry, check for fit and binding. Ambidextrous convenience is useless if the mag release sticks under stress. Optics mounting is another angle most shooters overlook. The RXM ships with suppressor height iron sights and a modular optic mounting system. They include posts to accept popular footprints, RMR and Holosun style footprints without an adapter plate. If you're swapping slides or cutting your cover plate, confirm those posts seat flush. A loose optic base will ruin point of impact after 10 rounds and ruin confidence during a stressful malfunction drill. Finally, torque and break-in etiquette. When you reassemble the upper onto the chassis, run a careful zero check at the range before you trust it on a defensive load. If your aftermarket chassis uses different tolerances, your barrel lockup and slide travel can shift POI. Start with a slow 10-round test, then escalate. Confidence is earned in single-digit drills, not wishful thinking in the workshop. Up next, I'll take this built-up RXM to the range. I'll measure group sizes, test function with a variety of magazines and ammo weights, and push that trigger through dynamic transitions. Spoiler: the way it rides through recoil tells you whether the modular promise is real or just marketing. I stepped off the bench and onto the firing line with the built-up RXM, a fresh magazine seated, and a mix of factory and aftermarket parts under my hands. The first thing I wanted to prove was simple. Does this modular heart beat like a real fighting pistol when you put real defensive ammo through it? 10 rounds at a time, slow and deliberate. I worked from a steady rest into controlled pairs and then into rapid strings. The results tell you more than pictures. With a factory 9mm barrel and a fresh, properly torqued slide, I opened with relatively mild full metal jacket loads to check reliability and basic lockup. Groups on 8-inch targets were respectable from 6 yards, hovering around a tight cluster that would make any new gun owner comfortable. Next, I fed defensive loads hollow points in the typical 120 to 130 grain class and watched the gun smile through feeding. No stovepipes, no failures to eject. Even when I abused magazine seating during a mag change drill, those Glock Gen 3 mags slid in like old friends and dropped cleanly when I hit the release with a deliberate thumb. Trigger feel under fire held true to the gauge numbers. The pull was predictable, roughly 4 to 4.5 pounds, and the reset was short enough to get into fast follow-up shots without hunting for the shoe. Recoil impulse was manageable. The aluminum aftermarket frame dampened muzzle flip just a hair compared to the polymer lower. That helped when I pushed the gun into transition drills between target A and target B. The chassis let me get the sights back on target faster than I expected. Now, magazines are a critical story here. I tested Gen 3 factory mags, aftermarket high-capacity magazines, and some older Gen 2 tubes from my stash. All functioned, but subtle differences showed up in speed reloads. The Gen 3 factory followers fed clean every time. Some of the aftermarket high-capacity magazines had a slightly stiffer follower tension and required deliberate seating during rapid reloads. That is a magazine issue, not an RXM issue. If you're building your kit, inventory your magazines and practice with the ones you intend to carry. Optics and zero. I mounted a popular miniature reflex on those supplied posts, then ran a 5-shot zero at 7 yards. The point of impact shifted a little compared to the stock sights, nothing catastrophic, but something to note. After a few live fire strings, heat and slide to frame mating settled and the POI tightened up. Moral here: whenever you change chassis or slide cover plate geometry, verify zero under live fire conditions before trusting any sight picture at distance. Durability checks. After 200 rounds of mixed rotary work mags dumped, immediate action drills, and a few high-rate strings, I inspected pins and springs. Everything stayed seated when the aftermarket spring was correctly transplanted. Miss that spring and you're courting a wandering pin scenario that will bite you on the timeline. So what's the takeaway from the range? The RXM's modular concept isn't a gimmick. It can be built into a genuinely competent duty or carry gun, provided you respect the details. Spring transfers, pin seating, magazine selection, and optic mounting. But there's one more test that separates a ho-hum tool from a real piece of kit. How does it handle a forced malfunction under pressure, a failure to fire, coupled with a bad mag and a ticking clock? I put that exact scenario on the clock, and the results surprised me. I set the timer and lit the range clock. Scenario: a primerless round in the middle of a string, a partially loaded magazine with a suspect follower, and a shooter's heartbeat that's trying to outpace their hands. That's the real test, not pretty strings on paper, but an ugly, messy interruption when sight picture and plan suddenly go sideways. The goal was to see whether the RXM built from a serialized FCI and an aftermarket chassis would let me recover fast and keep the fight on my terms. First strike, a light primer strike. The slide didn't lock back because the magazine still had rounds. Standard immediate action tap rack assess played out. I hit the magazine, pulled the slide, and chambered a fresh round. The trigger broke clean. That's the baseline for a modern striker-fired design. Predictable, repeatable, forgiving under stress. Next, I forced a stovepipe by feeding a low-power round and then slapping a slightly stiff aftermarket magazine into the well. The feeding failure landed exactly where maintenance and magazine consistency matter most. Quick remedial action: lock the slide to the rear, clear the mangled brass, and inspect the follower. The truth was obvious. Some high-capacity aftermarket magazines have slightly higher follower tension and needed a firmer seating stroke during a reload. There's no shame in training for that. There's plenty of shame in not practicing it. But here's the headline that made me lean forward. When I ran the same malfunction drill with the FC I installed in a frame missing that little captive leaf spring, the gun began to show symptoms I wouldn't trust on a fight night. Pins walked a hair under extended strings. The slide drag changed subtly. Under the clock, those subtle changes turned into hesitation. When you're counting on instinct, even a millimeter of shift in slide travel is a betrayal. Swap the spring back in, secure the pins, and the pistol calmed. Lockup returned to normal. The slide returned to its cadence. It's not mystical, it's mechanical. That tiny spring and those cutouts in the big pin exist to keep everything indexed under recoil, and if you skip that step when transplanting an FCI into a boutique chassis, you've invited trouble. The modular idea only pays off when you honor every small part that makes the design coherent. Maintenance lessons from the clock: always inspect captive springs when you change frames. Run a 200-round break-in with a variety of magazines while monitoring pin play. Do a live fire zero with your optic under heat to check for thermal shift. And practice malfunction clearance with the exact magazine batch you'll carry. Combat confidence is the product of repetition with the real kit. Beyond mechanics, there's a deeper point to make. Modularity changes the mental model of ownership. You no longer treat the frame as the authoritative gun, you treat the insert as law and the chassis as fashion. That opens creative possibilities, but also shifts responsibility. If you build, you must verify. If you upgrade, you must test. The RXM can be a brilliant, personalized fighting tool, or it can be a pretty paperweight that fails when it matters. So what does that mean for you, watching this in the shop or from your phone? Respect the FCI. Respect springs. Respect magazines. Don't buy into modular freedom without a checklist and a range regimen. The tool is only as reliable as the smallest part that holds it together. If you want to get hands-on, come by the Glock store in Nashville. We'll run through the transplant, set your zero, test your magazines, and I'll show you the exact spring capture trick that saved my strings. This thing is tempting to build into a custom showpiece, but treat it like a fighting tool first, because when the buzzer beats down the barrel, little details decide whether you walk away